Awesemo Fantasy Football. Are you tired of that groupthink mentality? Are you tired of fantasy football's industry consensus, everyone repeating the same analysis over and over again? Then try the data-driven approach we have at Awesemo.com, driven by Alex Awesemo Baker, the world's #1 daily fantasy football player. This season, he has loaned his projections expertise to creating our first ever premium season-long fantasy football rankings. So head over to Awesemo.com to find out more about our different approach to fantasy football. Now, let's dive into how those rankings would attack drafting from the 103. At the 103, it's a pretty easy pick here, Ezekiel Elliott. That's consensus in most drafts, but the thing that makes it different is we actually have him as a slight value here, taking him over Saquon Barkley if push comes to shove. Barkley has the edge in receptions, but we saw that decrease a bit last year. He dropped 1.7 receptions per game to a flat 4, and if he is not going to be this massive difference maker as a receiving running back, Ezekiel Elliott plays on the better team. Dallas averaged 6.5 yards per play last season. That led the league by a pretty wide margin. That gives him a much better chance to score touchdowns. At the end of the day, that's what you're shooting for in fantasy football, is guys who can put up massive touchdown seasons like we saw McCaffrey do. And while Barkley's receiving game is better, it doesn't make up for the touchdowns in Awesemo's projections. So at the 103 is a slight value there. At the 210, Austin Eckler. This was a similar pick in the 102 draft where Austin Eckler does end up going at the 2-3 turn. And again, this team is going to side with those Awesemo projections. Eckler doesn't typically fall this far, but you have to take the value when he does. He played 4 games without Melvin Gordon last year, and he was utterly stunning in those games. The dude is a killer. He averaged 14 carries and 6 receptions per game. He posted 490 yards from scrimmage. The dude scored 6 times. You got to be kidding me. He was so good. And Eckler isn't going to assume all of that role again, but he doesn't have to at this cost. His job is going to expand, similar to what we saw at the beginning of last season, and that's worth it at the 210. At the 303, I'd say by ADP, this is a pretty sizable reach, but by Awesemo's projections, this is the best pick. Cooper Kupp, he had a weird 2019 campaign. He had a 220-yard game. He scored 10 times, and there was that one game where he was basically benched. He played 34.3% of his team's offensive snaps in Week 14, while Sean McVay just, for some reason, trotted out a decrepit Brandon Cooks. But the team got rid of Cooks. They saw what he could, or I guess couldn't do for the team, and shipped him off to Houston for very little. So with Cooks out of the picture for good, Kupp should come closer to the player he was in the first half of 2019, the wide receiver 2 overall. Awesemo's projections love him at the 303. At the 410, it's James Conner. David Johnson is the alternative here, and he's actually slightly favored by Awesemo's projections, but I can't keep taking David Johnson every single draft that Awesemo's projections want us to do. So we make a slight deviation, and James Conner is still an awesome value here. Last season, we saw James Conner be still an efficient back, at least an elusive back. He was top 15 in evaded tackles per touch. His offense just wasn't going to let him do much because of Devlin Hodges and Mason Rudolph being subpar, hardly backup level quarterbacks. Now with the infusion of Ben Roethlisberger back into the team, we should see something closer to what we saw 2 years ago from James Conner. So David Johnson may be a slightly better pick by projections, but if you look at this series of drafts as, say, a best ball portfolio or even a season-long portfolio with 12 different teams, mix it up a little bit, it's still another great value in James Conner. At the 503, the other side of this turn, Keenan Allen, another pick based on simply value. Awesemo's projections aren't massively high on Keenan Allen like they are with James Conner or David Johnson, but at the 503, it's a worthwhile pick. You know, we saw after Keenan Allen struggled through a rash of injuries in his first 3 seasons, he hasn't missed a game since 2017. He's been incredibly consistent. He's averaged 148 targets per season since then. And many people are going to be scared off by Tyrod Taylor's presence to converting some of his dropbacks into scrambles, but he's generally been considered a timid passer, guy who's willing to dump it off and check it down, just take the easy yards, and that should funnel targets easily to Allen and Eckler, who's already on this team. So not only by taking Allen are we betting on that, but we also just get an easy layup for a Chargers stack. At the 610, Michael Gallup. We've got to start giving Michael Gallup more credit as the potential top option, the top receiver in Dallas. He tore his meniscus in week 2. He missed 2 games, and then he came back absolutely on fire. From week 5 onward, Michael Gallup led Dallas in targets at 98, air yards over 1,100. It's possible that the top receiver just went in the 610. It's possible that Dallas's top receiver just went to this team at the 610. At the 703, we take Will Fuller. This is another one where it's so hard not to draft Will Fuller in every one of Awesemo's drafts. Deshaun Watson has thrown 30 or more passes to 12 different players in his NFL career. Fuller leads all 12 with 10.9 adjusted yards per attempt when targeted. His deep routes are just some of the most valuable routes a receiver can run, and they generate fantasy points in droves. His health is a concern, but injuries can often be fluky at the 703. This is just too good to pass on. At the 810, we take John Brown here. Some alternatives considered were Jamison Crowder and Emmanuel Sanders, and all three of these options fell within a round of each other based on Awesemo's projections. Brown was simply the move because he's probably the best outright receiver in terms of talent. Sanders, when he was in his prime, was likely better, but he's gone 3 years without a 1,000-yard season. The Broncos and 49ers have also actively made moves to pass on him, the Broncos trading on him and the 49ers choosing not to pursue him in free agency, so that should tell you something about him as a receiver. And Crowder, on the other hand, has just never hit quadruple digits, never hit 1,000 yards as a receiver. John Brown, paired with Josh Allen, who has a cannon for an arm, is a match made in heaven. Stephon Diggs is definitely a threat to him, but at 810, that has been all but baked out of the cost. At the 903, the pick here is easy. Hayden Hurst. There are really no other alternatives. Given that this team needed a tight end, we couldn't avoid missing out on Hurst here. Awesemo's projections absolutely love him. He enters a team missing 258 targets from 2019. That's the most in the league by nearly 70 targets. And he was an effective tight end in his limited role last year. He posted 8.7 yards per target, top 10 for a tight end, and he was 6th in yards per route run at 2.44. Hurst, being an older prospect coming into the NFL, was probably set up to not exceed his first-round expectations, but at this point, being the 903 on a team in need of tight end production, he's a pretty easy selection here per Awesemo's projections. At the 1010, Cam Newton. Cam Newton is free money in fantasy this year. Awesemo's rankings have a massive chasm between Newton and the alternative pick here, who's a fine pick in his own right, Matthew Stafford. The risk of Newton changing teams and coming off a mostly lost season closes that gap. You have to factor in not just projections, but risks, which Awesemo's projections do have. If you check out our projections, we have risks on certain players, and Newton has a high risk, but it's not worth the discrepancy in fantasy points you're getting by taking him. Newton has a career mark of 38.4 rushing yards per game on 7.5 carries per game. That is so hard to beat. Just on the yards alone, that's an extra passing touchdown per game. So it's an easy pick here. With running back taken care of early, this is a team that can easily afford the roster space of drafting 2 tight ends and 2 quarterbacks. With both the 9 and 10 being our tight end and quarterback, it might make sense to double up on those positions. Tyrod Taylor getting our Chargers stack in the final rounds of this draft is going to be free money, and maybe a high upside tight end like Blake Jarwin makes sense here too. Thank you for tuning in to another Awesemo Fantasy Football video. Don't forget to hit that like button and comment with your favorite or your least favorite pick out of the 10 rounds here. And don't hesitate to head on over to awesemo.com/fantasy football to sign up for our draft kit, which includes a bunch of awesome stuff, our rankings, our strength of schedule tool, breakouts, and the draft wingman, which helps you build optimal lineups for your best ball and season-long leagues. And you get all of this just for $29.95. Thanks for tuning in, guys.